We are honored to welcome for the very first time. It's a little confusing for me because I went to see him at a short store, so it feels like the second time. Steve Almond, author of All the Secrets of the World, his hard to believe very first novel. The book has been receiving wonderful reviews, including, if I may quote, Zach Ruskin in the San Francisco Chronicle. For those who recall Colin McCann's brilliant Let the Great World Spin, a similar, albeit entirely original approach and payoff employed, whereas McCann built a fictional ensemble about a real-life exploits of acrobat Philippe Pellicet. Almond channels the inner monologue of Nancy Reagan, who dwells on the recent assassination attempt of her husband as she frets over crime headlines and consults an astrologer for advice on what actions to take, and contrasts those imagined forays into the First Lady's mind with another character's harrowing journey into the heart of America's criminal justice system, offering one of many ways in which this novel rightfully earns its lofty title. Steve Almond is the author of 11 books of fiction and nonfiction, including the New York Times bestseller Candy Freak and Against Football. His essays and reviews have been published in the New York Times Magazine, Plowshares, Poets and Writers. His short fiction has appeared in Best American Short Stories, the Pushcart Prize, and Best American Mysteries, and he is the recipient of grants from the Massachusetts Cultural Council and the National Endowment for the Arts. He co-hosted the Dear Sugars podcast with his friend Cheryl Strayed and teaches creative writing at the Nieman Fellowship at Harvard and Wesleyan. And today we are honored, and you'll see a little connection here if you pay attention to the puzzle. We are honored to have Almond in conversation with Mary Louise Schumacher, a beloved Milwaukee artist and independent filmmaker. She was the 2017 Arts and Culture Nieman Fellow, and she is well known for her tenure as arts critic of the journal Sentinel, and is currently at work on Out of the Picture, the first documentary film about art critics to be made in the US that documents a period of generational transformation and cultural reckoning. With that, please give them a big hand. Thank you very much for coming.
Hey, everybody. Can you hear me? Good. So I think we're going to jump right in with you reading a little bit. Am I right?
Yeah, okay. I will read. And it's so nice. How many people is this the first reading of like live reading event you've been to in a while? Yeah, thank you. Yeah. We're out of practice at being human. It's really a delight to be in the same room with you. It's different. Online is wonderful. We love you if you're out there, but like there's something about being a body in an actual space, and you're all very attractive. They told me Milwaukee was not going to be especially attractive, but they lied. All right, the East Coast elites about whom you hear so much. This book is crazy. It's nuts. I'm not sure how it came out of me, but it did. It's set in California in 1981, the time when there were phones attached to walls, and the people, in order to interact, had to go to people's houses, like when we were kids. And it begins with a well-meaning teacher pairing two young women together for the science fair. Lorena Saenz, who is Honduran American, American by birth by a couple of months, and her family's undocumented. They've come up partly so that she can have American citizenship from El Salvador and Honduras. And she is paired in this 8th grade science fair with Jenny Stallworth, the Jenny Stallworth, beautiful, blonde, wealthy. And the moment that Lorena, because this is 1981 and they don't just text in Google Doc, Lorena has to go visit the Stallworths. And the moment she walks into their beautiful mint green mansion, she's quite transfixed. And each of the Stallworth parents take an unnatural interest in her as well. I'll just read a little bit from the beginning of the book, since this book, unlike my previous failed novels, has a plot. There are actual spoiler alerts, which is kind of a shock for me. The general spoiler alert for my short stories would be, at the end of the story, the man is also lonely. Spoiler alert, okay. But in this book, there's a lot of plot. So as they're paired for this science fair, Mrs. Stallworth, Rosemary Stallworth, gets the idea that maybe it would be interesting for the girls to talk with and perhaps get the advice of Jenny Stallworth's father, Marcus, who is a scorpiologist. He's a research biologist who specializes in scorpions. And so they wind up out in the desert, and I'll just read that little scene. You should know that Jenny Stallworth has had, as in preparation for this little expedition, Marcus, her dad, has put snake chaps on the girls, and Jenny's like, I am not going anywhere requiring snake chaps, a sentiment with which I agree. So she bows out of it. So Lorena is left with Marcus Stallworth and Jenny's older brother, Glenn, who's like kind of a jerk soccer player. That's the me character, actually. Mr. Stallworth led them into the darkness. He lugged an oversized lantern, which he set down on a small rise. Close your eyes and keep them shut until I say, do it, Glenn murmured. Okay, open. An iridescent purple light gleamed out in all directions. Lorena's eyes scrolled an ocean of sand upon which now lay scattered scores of tiny glow-in-the-dark toys, the sort kids on TV pulled from cereal boxes. Then the toys began to move. Lorena gasped. These were living creatures, many-legged and scrabbling like tiny lobsters. Welcome to Scorpionville, Glenn said. Lorena glanced at the sand around her feet. A scorpion the length of a hairpin labored under the weight of its stinger, which hung like a fanged jewel over the armored segments of its body. Don't be frightened, Mr. Stallworth said. He was suddenly right beside her. I'm not, Lorena replied. What do you think? There, Lorena cast about for the right word, stunned to find the truth in such a simple one. They're beautiful. She could feel Mr. Stallworth inspecting her face, trying to figure out if she really meant it. He took off his glasses and began furiously polishing the lenses with the hem of his shirt. For a queer moment, Lorena imagined grabbing his glasses and tossing them away. We're going to take any home, Glenn said. Glenn's kind of, as I mentioned, like a soccer player, kind of basically the me kid. We're going to take any home. That's probably how he says it. Glenn asked. Mr. Stallworth pulled a small flashlight from his pocket and swept the purple beam across the sand. We might as well see who's hunting tonight. To Lorena's astonishment, he knelt down and guided a scorpion onto his palm. The animal was the size of a matchbox. Its pincers pawed the air. Shouldn't you have gloves? Lorena said. You just come at them from behind, Glenn said. They can't sting backwards. They're not aggressive animals, Mr. Stallworth explained. They just want to be left alone. Mr. Stallworth returned his focus to the animal. You see these little hairs along their legs, he said. This is how they hunt, by touch, by vibration. They can register the movement of a single grain of sand from 10 yards away. Why do they shine? Lorena said. Nobody knows. Fluorescence must convey some kind of evolutionary advantage, but it's still their little secret. Glenn asked his father to find a scorpion he could pick up. Mr. Stallworth scanned the ground with his magic light. These are your best bet, he said. Sand scorpions. Aren't they poisonous? Lorena said. This species isn't too bad. She watched Mr. Stallworth gently prod the scorpion onto Glenn's hand. The creature scampered along his knuckles. It looked glum, menacing, painfully shy. Are you going to pick one up? Glenn asked Lorena. I'm sure she's had enough excitement for one night, Mr. Stallworth said. I'm not scared. The words came out louder than Lorena intended. More softly, she added, I'd like to hold one. Mr. Stallworth switched on the lantern. He stared at her face again, half in wonder, and picked up another one, bluish under the light. A gentle species, he said. Its sting no worse than a wasp. She reached out, and Mr. Stallworth uncurled her fingers. The earth was trembling. Then she realized that it was her and not the earth. You don't have to do this, Mr. Stallworth said. I know. Do you trust me? She met his gaze and nodded, and Mr. Stallworth lowered the animal onto her. No way, Glenn said. I told you, he gets all the good lines. The creature clung to the knob of her wrist like a charm. Slowly, tentatively, it began to move toward her hand, the legs rising and falling like jointed oars. Lorena's pulse lurched. She closed her eyes to keep from flinching. Tiny feet tickled her palm. She felt a dampness beneath her clothes, the dizziness of what was going to happen next. When she could stand it no longer, she opened her eyes. The scorpion was perched on her thumb, perfectly still. its stinger hoisted like a tiny scythe. He appears to like you, Mr. Stallworth said. I'll stop there. It gets creepier and creepier, but let's stop there.
Okay. Yeah, a little applause, I think, for that would be in order. Yeah, congratulations on this novel and some really beautiful writing in this book, Steve. I mean, just beautiful craft. And I thought it would be nice to start by just telling all of you a little bit about how I actually came to know Steve. Like that might be a good place to the context for our conversation. So I know Steve as a teacher. So the aforementioned Nieman Fellowship that Daniel mentioned was a real gift to my life. It meant I could step away from my life as a journalist and go off to Harvard and take all the classes I wanted to. And the Nieman Foundation actually had this really a handful of courses that they, in fact, organized just for the fellows. And so I think it was twice a week. And I had just met this cohort of humans who had become very dear to me. We go into the basement of Lipman House, which is the home base for this fellowship, and we would attend Steve's class. And what you have to understand is that we were all like kind of hard scrabble journalists. We've been told our entire careers, like, your story, the story is never about you. You never use the first person. You write about other people. And there's all kinds of psychological reasons that journalists are doing that kind of writing. And Steve came along and basically said, actually, if you've been doing this for as long as you have lived some life and you have seen some things, and you probably have stories of your own to tell. And so we all ventured into the craft of memoir writing, which was terrifying and exciting. And we really, like, the stories and the voices that came out of that room were extraordinary. And some of these voices I still treasure to this day. And it was this incredibly loving kind of setting and a real truth-telling setting. And I really attribute that to the people around the table, and Nieman, of course, but really especially Steve, who is just like this incredibly empathetic person who could look at a piece of writing and actually not only tell you about the writing, but tell you about the writer behind the writing. And I mean, I literally, like, I won't share some of the things that I learned about myself in that seminar, but it was like kind of profound. You know, I was sort of hiding out as a writer, and Steve got me to see that. And that is kind of the power of kind of what you do, which is like words and empathy somehow mixed and remixed in all of the ways that you work in the world. So you're amazing.
And we're done. And scene. Go by the book.
Sorry, I had to gush for just a minute, but that's how we know each other. We had this like really transformative for the writers in the room experience together. And so my first question for you, Steve, is, you know, you've done so much writing. You've been a reporter. You've done criticism. You've done essays and short stories. This is your first novel. So for the guy who helps other writers get unstuck, like, why did it take you 30 years to write a novel, something that you've wanted to do your whole life?
So she begins with a softball. Okay. Yeah, I mean, I was writing novels the whole time. They were just terrible novels. And they were terrible because, as a friend pointed out to me some years ago, I don't think you really want to write a novel. I think you want to be a novelist. And I was like, oh, let me get angry at that comment because it is so deeply accurate. I think when you're making art of whatever sort, like, the idea is that you have to get more interested in the story that you're telling or the piece of art that you're creating than your own ego, which wants to have the feeling of whatever, regard, attention. And so the subtext of these previous novels was something along the lines of, aren't I clever? Aren't I sensitive? Aren't I a good writer? Do you like me yet? How about now? Which is really boring. I mean, you know, we're living that story all the time on Facebook and all the other kind of trying to advertise to the world. And what happened really is that I was writing these terrible novels one after another. I'm condensing like 4 or 5 years of failure and several years afterwards of therapy into like one sentence there. Like there's a long process. But I would sort of bounce back from the failed novels by writing nonfiction or by writing short stories, which felt more attainable to me. And I think that's a really useful thing to realize. People are very, I think Americans are especially ashamed of failure, which is too bad, because that's actually the thing you learn from. You know, when you succeed at something, it's, I think, kind of mystical and hard to understand. You're just in a flow state. But when you fail, it's possible to look at, as we were doing in the workshop, try to say, well, where are the decisions where genuine curiosity and humility gives way to self-regard, or the writer trying to impress the reader? Like, where are the places where we're hiding the story, needlessly confusing the reader because we're uncertain about the story? All these things that, as a teacher, it's really easy for me to see. As a writer of my own nonsense, it's almost impossible. In retrospect, I look at these novels and go, my God, how could I have wasted so much time? But actually, those failures were cleansing for me, because they allowed me to sort of cast off the idea that I was supposed to write the great American novel. And I was supposed to sort of, what novel should I be writing? And then I was able to ask a much more useful question, which is what book do I want to write? What am I genuinely interested in, whether it's the moral interrogation of football or my obsession with candy and the confectionery industry and what it says about late model capitalism, blah, blah, blah. I think the world is endlessly fascinating if you're curious, if you're genuinely curious about it. I had to give up on the dream of writing a novel because it was becoming so much a kind of narcissistic talisman that I was never going to find those keys. I was looking for them too hard. And so I had to sort of say at a certain point, sort of in my late 40s, like, okay, Almond, maybe you'll never write a novel. That's fine. The world will be just fine without your novel. And you'll be just fine. You're still doing interesting, meaningful work. And I think giving up, in a sense, and saying, okay, I surrender, was really crucial. It opened some kind of imaginative space for the muse to walk into my life, Lorena Saenz. And once she entered the picture, this extraordinarily intelligent, ambitious, courageous, and in some ways naive young woman, just what you want, from Jane Eyre to, you know, all through the canon of Dickens and so forth. That's what you want as a protagonist whose circumstances are limited, but whose capacities are incredible. They're really up against, they want to make their story bigger, because that places them in danger. They become suddenly visible, right? Like the scorpions, they fluoresce. And for Lorena, that's very dangerous. So I had the engine of that story. And rather than, I don't know, worrying about the prose, I was just much more curious to kind of chase Lorena and to follow the decision she was making and the dangers those decisions led her into, rather than worrying about what generally happens when we don't know the story we want to tell, which is you start bullying the language around. You start kind of auditioning plots. In this case, I very quickly knew what the arc of the book was going to be, and I was just racing to keep up. So it never felt labored.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about Lorena. And we actually started to get into this in the car on the way over here, and we stopped ourselves from having a really good conversation. This is also a little bit of a, in the spirit of our seminar, a little bit of a, loving but tough question.
Okay.
Right?
Number two.
So, one of the things I think is a kind of a question of our time right now is, who gets to tell whose stories, right? Like, there are entire imprints now that are about, Latina artists telling Latina stories and that sort of thing. And I have to tell you truthfully, like, the first section of the book is really different than the rest of the book. Like, I feel like the opening section of the book is really this section about these two 13-year-old girls and how they meet and kind of their discovery of themselves and each other and their sense of desire. And I will just confess to you, like, there were moments where I just had to kind of put the book down and just say, wow, like, how do I feel about this coming from Steve, coming from a white guy? And so let me just ask you, like, how did you make the decision to write the story of a 13-year-old Latina girl?
Yeah, I didn't really make that decision. if you know what I mean. That's not really how it worked. It's of course, an important, a crucial question. We're in a time where, white dudes have written all of history. That's history as we know it. And they're sort of on the margins. Howard Zinn or whoever else is saying, actually, I think there might be another perspective. But the central thing we call history, and for that matter, literary canon, is largely just the imaginings of the writings, the transcription of white dudes. And we're in this long overdue moment where that is being rightfully not just challenged, but modified so that the voices of people who are woefully underrepresented or not represented at all, those stories are being recorded. I think for me, the question was much more, once Lorena was sort of, the muse walked her into my life, that's the person who I'm riding with. This is a ride or die situation. That's the person that my imagination is compelled by or occupied by. I did not worry about or think about representation other than to say my job in this novel is to be understanding and sympathetic towards every character, from Lorena on up to Nancy Reagan, who would be very easy to flatten out into caricature. What I can't stand in any kind of writing and any kind of art really is contempt or condescension. It is your job, literally, the job description is to love your characters, not to approve of everything they do, but to regard them and pay attention to their inner lives and why they make the decisions they make. I don't believe anybody is purely good or evil, victim or villain. Everybody is some confounding combination. One of the reasons scorpions were so interesting to me is that they view themselves as prey. They're very frightened. We view them as predatory, and certainly the creatures that they eat. But that's kind of the human arrangement. We are always feeling that we're always constructing a story where we're sort of the victim, and anything we do is just reasonable self-defense. We're living, in fact, in the kind of eugenic hysteria generated by that mindset in this country. And so for me, I think I just got interested in Lorena, and Lorena ran me into a whole bunch of other characters. And the moment I ran into the police officers in this book, and Nancy Reagan, and the Stallworth parents, and Lorena's family, the moment I encountered them, my question was, well, what's their stake in this story? And what is going on in their inner life? The one thing I would say about the issue of representation is artists of whatever sort, especially writers, have to at least have permission to imagine their way into other people's lives. That's their job. If we don't allow them to, then every single writer becomes just a representative of their own experience, right? And if I did that, I would be centering my story, the story of like an anxious and well-meaning white dude who was born on third base. I was interested, I think, in Lorena intuitively because I've been sort of tracking, and in an anguished way, in nonfiction books mostly, but also in my stories, really the moral decline of the United States. And to me, growing up during the Reagan Revolution, this was something that I'd been turning over and reflecting on for years. I grew up in California like Lorena. I'm the same age as she is. So not only do I know the world that she was moving through, but I remember Reagan and the assassination attempt and that great gauzy myth that he spun for America, that America was a shining mansion on a hill. And that was a beautiful myth, like all fairy tales. It was very seductive, but nobody really ever asked, well, wait a second, who lives in that mansion? And who cleans that mansion? And who gets arrested if they trespass upon the mansion? And those felt to me like, questions that I wanted to investigate, not in a journalistic way, not as a cultural critic, but by writing what we call a social novel, which is a novel that is trying to represent what happens when people with power collide with the powerless. This is back to Hugo and through Dickens and in the American tradition, De Passos and Ralph Ellison, or Neil Hurston, certainly Steinbeck. That's the gig. And in order to write a social novel, you have to move into everybody's experience so that you understand that even the people who behave corruptly believe themselves to be the hero of the story. They're telling a story that justifies their behavior.
Yeah, and the book just, first of all, I want to just say that that answer feels so kind of in keeping with all the things that you've done, with Dear Sugars and with your teaching, that there is this, you're bringing love to your work. Like most, novelists don't sit down and say you have to love your subjects quite that plainly and openly, which I kind of love. And it shows in the book. I mean, I really ended up loving Lorena by the end of this book. And I think where she begins and where she ends, without giving too much away, are really, she's transformed by the end of the book, and really, is giving herself what she gets from other people in the beginning of the book, right? Yeah. And the book, after this first section, it just kind of opens up and opens and just keeps opening up. And it's really very epic. It's full of metaphor. I think the principal metaphor might be the scorpion, but it's also this kind of the seriousness and the life and death nature of the landscape in California. There is just a family that is absorbing injustice, like for the entire last, sections of the book, so much of which feels just really inevitable. Like it does not feel like anything that could have been ever altered. And it really does, I think, draw a line to where we are today, right? Can you talk a little bit about power in the book? I mean, I'm really interested in, for example, so Nancy Reagan comes into this book and she is like these little pinpricks, like she just is there and she's gone. But forgive the pun, there's like this trickle down of her power that just impacts the whole incredible story that unfolds. You want to talk a little bit about her and that?
So if you I know you're going to buy 10 or 11 copies each. So just so you know, to let people know, those are Nancy Reagan's eyes, right? That's Nancy Reagan. It's one of the little kind of Easter eggs. So Nancy Reagan was, I mean, if you had said like, Steve, sometime down the line, you're going to write a novel and Nancy Reagan's going to be a central character, I would have laughed at you for a week. That was not somebody who I thought would be sucked out of my subconscious and into the book. But in a sense, that she was the most challenging character, because I really do think this. When I say love, I don't mean you approve of all the characters. I mean, you make an honest attempt to understand what's up with them, right? If you take evil to be, I believe evil is really the distortion of love. That's not my idea, right? It's somehow our love gets distorted into evil or into destructive actions. And Nancy Reagan is somebody who, it was a real challenge for me, because I wanted to, I said it in Sacramento because, I grew up in the Bay Area, but I was interested in sort of how state power runs, how the state, and Reagan was very interested in that as well. His essential feeling was deregulate everything, let the corporations run everything. But the one place where the state should become more powerful is in the matter of criminal justice. And he believed this. Late in the book, there's a speech that he actually gave in California. And what he said was very stark. There are certain people who are born inherently evil. Don't let any social worker or psychiatrist or whatever tell you otherwise. People's behaviors are not the product of social conditions. They're just inherently, some people are good and some people are bad. And we need to protect the good people from the bad people. And none of this was overt in its mention of race or class. It's now become quite overt, right? And as I was writing the book, it was incredibly overt. But at that time, it was just certain people. It was still kind of hidden from view. So Nancy Reagan is quite easy to write off as this sort of modern Marie Antoinette with her Gucci bags and her China patterns and so forth. And so for me, once I encountered her, I did not want her to be flattened out into that kind of caricature. She behaves the way she does for particular reasons. And a good novelist, a good writer is curious. Doesn't just say, oh, what a superficial person. That's nonsense. No, we can't be superficial if we try. I mean, we're trying as hard as we can and it's not working. We all have a rich, complex inner life. That's just the burden of doing business as a human. So for Nancy Reagan, what I was able to understand was, look, she might be unbelievably sort of privileged and blind to it, but also she loved her husband. She saw him as destined to lead the country. She fully believed. And when he's shot and almost killed, she goes into the same kind of panic that any of us would. And she adopts whatever belief system she believes will keep her husband, her beloved, safe, as would any of us. So she doubles down on, to me, the kind of craziness of astrology. But I don't know. I think it's arrogant to assume that this or that belief system is, if whatever gets you through the night. And for Nancy Reagan, there's a reason why she's she sort of, without realizing it, injects herself into this case in a way that's calamitous. And I think that's terrible that she's able to do that, but that's a system problem. I'm much more sympathetic to how she operates as an individual, which is kind of weird. Like, I definitely for 40 years carried around this idea of Nancy Reagan that was just as bigoted can be. It was like, oh, she's just awful. She's everything that's wrong with the country, materialistic and vain and superficial and fame obsessed and blah, 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 blah. And that's like rhetoric. There's no poetry in that. There's no self-examination. And especially for a social novelist, your job is not to lecture the reader and teach them a lesson. It's to lead the reader into their own moral confusions. Any of the books that last, from Les Mis through, The Grapes of Wrath, or A Burning by Megha Majumdar, which is this remarkable social novel that I read, and it was like a revelation. But what's amazing about any of those books is that they are not interested in the author's noble opinions. They belong to the characters and the characters' experiences. And so if Nancy Reagan is one of those characters, then it's my job to figure out why she behaves as she does, so that the reader feels implicated rather than being able to sit in judgment and say, that Nancy, what a fool.
Do you want to talk a little bit about the scorpions and how did you come onto that idea as a metaphor? And would you just unpack the metaphor for us a little bit?
Sure, a little bit. First things first, Scorpio. Okay, how many other Scorpios in the room? How many? Am I alone? Am I going to have to hold down the whole thing here as a Scorpio? Oh my God. All right. Well, let me explain to the rest of you non-Scorpios. To me, Scorpion, so when you're writing anything, especially though a novel, a work of imagination, to me, it's like a rocket taking off, and like the fuel is the story. Is Lorena, is she going to be okay? Is she going to be able to keep herself and her people safe? But what happens is that the momentum of that story, almost like rocket boosters, sort of sucks stuff out of your subconscious, out of your memory. And those are usually events or experiences that are in some way unresolved. So I remember as a young reporter at like age 21, moving to El Paso, Texas, not having thought about the southern border of this country at all, as a very sheltered, cosseted Californian. Then I went to school at a fancy East Coast school. And so I hadn't thought about the fact that we have a southern border, that the United States is next door to a country that is much more economically impoverished. Much of what as I experienced it was unimaginable to me, literally unimaginable. That's how occluded my imagination was, my awareness of the world. And one of the things I was doing in El Paso was just doing crazy feature stories. So one night these scorpiologists took me out into the desert, and they lit up an ultraviolet lamp, and there on the desert floor, which I considered to be totally empty, was unbelievable life, and were these little creatures that are lit up. And a little bit like you were describing in class, like it's a frightening thing for human beings to reveal themselves and become visible. And also we're desperate to become visible and to be seen and regarded. It's this inherent conflict that we want to sort of show the world who we are and be lit up and aglow. And at the same time, it's very dangerous, especially for somebody like Lorena, whose family is undocumented. So for me, the scorpions were operating at that level. But then the more I learned about their biology, the more fascinated I became. That description, for instance, of how the scorpions have hairs along their legs and they can detect the movement of a single grain of sand like 10 yards away. That to me is what it was like in a family. That's how it feels to be around people who you love and hate a lot and who you're deeply affected by. That's human beings. That's how human beings are. That's a description of human beings, that we're so exquisitely sensitive and attuned, especially to people who matter to us a lot. So the more I thought about the scorpion, the creature that thinks it's prey but often acts like a predator, the more I thought, well, this is really a description of the human arrangement. And the more interested I became in like scorpions as kind of a central, whatever, leitmotif is the fancy term for it. So, but none of that was like me, like, oh, scorpions, I know. It was more just that experience I wanted to write about. And the moment I happened onto scorpions, then I did what you should do, which is a little bit of research. And it was so obvious to me that the description that the scorpions are, which we think of these creatures as very alien and scary and weird and the opposite of us. And I think about them and go, no, they're totally like us.
Yeah. And I think about the ways, and I might get this a little bit wrong, but you describe their kind of defensive, or there's questions about the ways in which they defend themselves. And I think about all the slipping narratives in your story. Like there's the stuff that happened, and then there's the way that everybody talked about it as time moved on. And I think about Rosemary in particular and how hard she became and how hard she worked to keep, the truth at arm's length. And I also think the media plays an incredibly important role in this book. It's brief, this section on the media, but it's like, there's kind of a big, like, it hinges on what they do too. Can you just talk a little bit about, because I feel like that's one of the themes of this book too, is how we tell our stories to each other and the impact that has on each other.
Yeah, I think so. One thing that helped drive the plot here is that I realized that the most interesting thing about somebody are their secrets. I mean, just think about it. We could go around the room. We won't, but we could go around the room. You're in luck, but we could. And the most interesting thing inside of each of you would be, what are you keeping secret? And there's two levels in which that operates. This guy's leaning over saying, all right, okay, nothing. I'm not keeping, I'm an open book. So that operates on two levels. One is the secrets we keep from the world. And the other and more dangerous is the secrets we keep from ourselves. Rosemary is an example, a tragic example of somebody who knows the truth of the ultimate kind of unwholesomeness of her marriage, of her partner's weaknesses and wounds and damage. And she just, like a lot of people, wants to just fake it because it's too painful to live in that truth. In a weird way, I think Dear Sugars was a lot of this, because when we were doing that podcast, we would get thousands of letters. And what those letters were like little scorpions lighting up. There were people saying, I can no longer bear to keep this secret about myself, about what's happening in my life. And so they would become visible. And I think part of the reason people appreciated the show is we weren't trying to fix anybody, but we were saying, wow, you're in a real moment of struggle, in a real period of struggle. We do not have the answer, but we will bear witness with you to what you're living through. And so for me, kind of the secrets that everybody was keeping were part of what kept the plot moving forward, that every scene was essentially the revelation of some kind of secret or another. The media, having been a reporter for many years, is interested in the opposite of a secret, which is the creation of not what the interesting story, which is what people are struggling with in their inner lives, but a kind of narrative that fits into the bigotries that are already established. So for me, part of where the story of the sort of criminal justice turn of the novel came from being an investigative reporter in Miami, where I covered a case called the Bird Road Rapist, who was a guy, somebody was sexually assaulting women in an area around Bird Road in Miami. And it was a case that got a nickname. And once there's a nickname and there's a narrative, that means that case has to get solved. And that case has to get solved regardless of what the facts suggest. So they arrested a guy named Louis Diaz, who was a Cuban-American immigrant. There was absolutely, sort of looking at it 20 years later as I did, you just go, wow, there's no way that any sensible society could decide that this person was guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. He seems absolutely innocent. I won't go through the litany. And he was eventually exonerated and freed from prison because of the Innocence Project. But the furor that was created and the pressures that were created in the police and prosecutors they stayed with me as well. And a lot of that was driven by the media's desire to kind of tell a big, scary story. And in fact, we've seen that really metastasize in the United States. Part of the reason that I'm going to say something political in a bookstore, I think I'm in a safe space. Part of the reason that the right in this country has become sort of so virulent and paranoid, conspiratorial, and violent in its habits of thought is because the media or the sort of, I don't even want to say the media, but it's no longer really an organ of journalism. It's kind of a factory that produces myths. And what the right has figured out is that if you ratchet up the threat level, people will really become dependent and watch. You can't say, like, we would like to deliver healthcare more efficiently in a system that's ruled by capitalism, but hopefully can be a bit more compassionate. That's kind of like the left's take on like affordable healthcare. The right just goes, they're going to kill your grandmother, and then they're going to take your guns, and then they're going to impose Sharia law. That's what's going to happen unless you remain vigilant. And that to me is dangerous and crazy, but it also is very effective. It's really a fictional technique. Once you ratchet up the threat level, you have people really in your thrall. And what we now realize much more clearly is this is really an attention economy. It's not about the epistemology of what can be established as true. It's about how much attention you can seize and how you can monetize that attention. And so the media is doing that here. They come up with the Death Valley Killer, and the moment they do that, in a sense, the die is cast.
We are running out of time, and I want to leave time for all of you to ask some questions. I'll ask one more question.
I would love it if you guys answered questions. I think it would be a lot more challenging.
I know we're all over the place here a little bit, but you're a literary guy, and I do want to ask you about the name Lorena and Lowe, because I know that is not a thing that's going to escape you. Is there a connection to your story to what is maybe the most known literary story about a young woman, Lolita? What's the relationship, if any?
Yeah, I think there is. I mean, there are no mistakes. But Lorena's, interestingly, that nickname that she gets is something that's put on her by Rosemary Stallworth, the kind of glamorous mom in this book. So it's something that's sort of imposed on her, not something she chooses for herself. But I think names are so fascinating. And oftentimes the way they operate is unconscious. You have Dickens, Mr. Pumblechook and Pip and all that, where it's like really obvious. But to me, the most interesting names are the ones that come from your artistic unconscious. So Lorena Signs, and people pointed out to me, I didn't figure this out. They were like, oh, I get it, like signs and wonder. And somebody else said, oh, I get it, science, like science, since this book is about science versus faith in part and kind of our belief systems. So my feeling is like the best names are the ones that are not clever, that are kind of arising from intuitive decision-making, where your artistic unconscious recognizes that there are these interesting evocations, but it's not like you putting on your big brainy literary hat and saying, I will choose this name because this person is thus and such.
Okay. So an accident, subconscious, but is there anything there? Sorry. Is there anything, did that come from your subconscious in a way that has meaning for you now?
only that people noticed it. And I was like, that's super cool. You're right. I wish I could claim credit for that.
Okay.
I will suddenly claim credit for that.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So I've been tasked with asking all of you to ask your questions, and I will then repeat it for the folks at home and the recording. So does anybody have a question?
And before you ask this question, if you could tell us your astrological sign,
That's
we
a great
can kind of get a
idea.
read on what it's about.
Yes.
My name is Christina. I'm a triple Aries. I like the water. My real question is
So the question is for all of you at home, from Christina Ward, who is a triple Aries, is what is the process when you're shifting from nonfiction writing to fiction writing? You're using some of the same tools, voice and intuition, but it's a very different thing. So what's that process for you?
Yeah. So when I teach at the Neiman, I'm teaching something called creative nonfiction. And I think there can be, people try to make this line blurry, but to me, it's very clear what nonfiction is, creative nonfiction, which is, a radically subjective version of events that objectively took place. That's the business you're in. And the moment you start consciously making up events and asserting them as if they've happened, that's great. It's an imaginative act. It's what I did in the novel, but it also has a name, and you should be honest with the reader about what you're up to, which is it's fiction, right? So for instance, like when I was 10 years old and I was in some dirt field in Hollister, California with my older brother, who I worship but also wanted to kill. We were hitting clods of dirt with an aluminum baseball bat, and he stepped into the path of my backswing. And yeah, thank you. Yes, it was a moment. And I could feel this kind of spongy crack. And then I turned around and the blood, was pouring out of his face. And I, for 30 or more years, carried around this idea of like, oh, I tried to kill my older brother. That's how angry I was at him. And wrote many terrible poems about it, one of which I eventually and unfortunately sent to him. And his response was quite interesting. He said, oh, no, you got it wrong. That's not what happened at all. What happened is I was warned repeatedly not to step into the path of that bat, and I did it anyway. It was my arrogance. Now, what's the truth of that experience? The truth, the only thing we can say, the truth is the blood and the truth is the scar that he still has. That's the truth. The rest is radically subjective, is our version of events. So that's nonfiction. You have to cleave to a set of events and what they mean. That's what great memoir, great writing of any sort, nonfiction, is an attempt to not just recollect events, but to reflect on their meaning. The project of a novel, it has a lot of that as well, but it is a set of incidents that you arrange for the maximum aesthetic, moral, emotional, and psychological impact. I can just pluck Nancy Reagan and say, Nancy Reagan, I believe, would have operated in this way in this situation. Blind her own privilege, meddling, but for reasons that are understandable to me as the author, not just her being a villain. And that's the delight of writing a novel or writing, because I'm a short story writer as well, is that you get to arrange the incidents for maximum impact. What we call plot is really the mechanism by which your characters are pushed up against their fears and desires. That's what plot is. And when you're writing fiction, you get to just arrange the incidents so that it is the maximum amount of psychological and emotional danger. That's what I did here. And I was delighted to finally kind of figure that out. For years in those terrible novels that nobody will ever read, thankfully, and that I once read to my wife and she fell asleep, like, those did not have what you would call rising action, and they didn't have a chain of consequence. The great pleasure of writing fiction is that you get to construct a chain of consequence. This happens, and therefore this next thing happens. And because that happened, this next thing happens. That's really delightful. Our own lives feel much more unmediated. Like we are trying in therapy and in our writing and the art we create and the stories we tell each other, we're trying to make meaning, but they oftentimes don't feel like, they sort of feel like a muddle. And I think a really artfully arranged novel can have the feeling of distilling away all the interstitial stuff and just focusing on the core stuff that drives particular characters into the heart of their own, ultimately their own internal conflicts. That's the real subject.
Tammy.
What sign are you? That would help us understand.
Taurus, Aries rising, and I just was a ton of breaks.
Okay, so this is a question from Tammy, who is a Taurus with Aries rising. And her question is about kind of emptying the process of your ego and letting go of that in order to kind of break through in the writing. And she is struggling with a piece of writing herself right now, and is just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how you do that.
Well, it's complicated because you've got your own thing that you would write under your own steam, and then you're writing for an editor who has a different agenda. So that's just the struggle of your creative decisions being interrogated and modified based on somebody else's sensibility and also their institutional priorities. I do not have a magic pill for that or anything. That's the struggle. That's part of the reason the Niemans get liberated, because they've been writing, journalism of whatever sort, and you suddenly give them James Baldwin and David Foster Wallace and Nora Ephron and Joan Didion, and they go, holy crap. You mean I have the right to be precise about my own experience? Wow, that's powerful. But this question of ego is really sort of, the question is, are you curious or are you writing to kind of try to solve a story problem that you haven't figured out, or because you just so are enamored of this, like you wrote about, you're talking about the section that's atmospheric, you have to figure out how much of that is serving the story. And if those atmospherics are really lovely, but they're not serving the story, then they just have to go somewhere else. They have to go live in another piece. And also anything you write, you wrote and it exists. So if it's not useful for this particular piece, if it doesn't serve this piece or this editor's version of this piece, then you just have to make your compromise with that and say, okay, okay, I'll use those paragraphs later on down the line, or the work that I did in creating them. I feel very strongly for, that any time you spend creating or struggling to create is time in heaven. It's very hard to feel that because writing in particular is excruciating. It's basically decision making, and you're just choked by doubt the whole time. But it's putting yourself in a position to make those decisions, even if they're failed decisions. What I don't love that it took me 30 years and many depressions to write a novel. I do not recommend that to anybody. That's not a good process. But I do like that it gave me a certain kind of window onto how important failure is in the process. There's this, I like this, sometimes I waste time on the internet. I don't know if you're familiar with it. There's this thing, the internet, and you can waste time on it. That's essentially what its job is. And then it gets you also to reveal everything about yourself so it can then market products to you. At any rate, you might have heard of it, the internet it's called. And there's this video that I would watch sometimes when I'm working on stuff, and I just found it one day and it just tickled me. It's a cat, and the cat in real life, it's a real cat, and the cat is trying to jump onto a roof. And the cat, some helpful internet person has put like mathematical equations over the cat's head, trajectory and velocity and so forth, so that you really get invested in the idea that this cat is figuring it out and this cat is going to do it. And the cat finally, after all this calculation, leaps and just plummets. It's just like, yards away from the roof. But what I love about this, that's how it feels most of the time to try to create. I feel like that cat. Those novels, 4.5 of them, were me leaping and missing. But here's the way that the cat reaches the roof. The cat does not get better at math. The cat does not go to the cat gym and get cat buff and suddenly can leap. The cat reaches the roof because the cat is standing on a mountain of its own failures. That's how it gets to the roof. Yeah.
Okay.
So I'm curious, you talked about that chain of consequence and then also sharing with us about the other novels that didn't make their way in.
She's so gentle. Those other novels that did not find they did not find their way into that form, i.e., were terrible and unpublished. Yes.
Well, I interested on your in the public policy. What did you?
So the question is from a tourist in the front row. How did you plot out Lorena's story? Did it just come to you? Was it a purely an imaginative thing? Or yeah, how did those events kind of dictate themselves to you?
Yeah, so this is really a question about process, I think. And the question sort of living underneath the question is, are you a planner? Do you have the vision board with all the sticky notes? Are you a pantser? Are you improvisatory? And underneath that question is, what's my process? And I don't know. I don't. I can only tell you that for me, this novel, the reason that I think I was able to write it, I am not a planner. I do not have the sticky notes and the organizational scheme. It's just not how my head works. I'm more associative and sort of trying to get into a flow state and trying to especially just be curious and follow the chain of consequence. If Lorena says this to Jenny and this secret is revealed later on down the line, that has to have a consequence. The central question I was asking of every scene and every moment really, and every word was, what work is it doing? If it's not doing work, if there are 3 adjectival modifiers and 2 of them are doing the same work, then one of them has to go. If those atmospherics are, doing the same work too frequently, then some of those have to go. It's really kind of, it's simple on a certain level. You look at each moment, each sentence, each scene and say, what work is it doing? Could be doing plot work. It could be doing setting work. It could be doing character work, but it's got to be doing some discernible work. For me, I followed Lorena because she was the engine of this thing. And every time she made a different decision, like the decision to become enamored of scorpions and to gain the regard of Marcus Stallworth and become increasingly drawn to him, that just set off, it set off a chain reaction of what was going to happen down the road. I was really just chasing that. That's good fortune. That's the muse and me allowing curiosity to overwhelm my ego to write beautifully or to craft a beautiful sentence or sort of flog the language. But process really belongs to you. And you need to think about, and this doesn't just apply to how plot gets constructed. It applies to like, how do I make room in my life to create whatever I'm creating? And what are the pressures that are on me? And when am I the most creative? At what time of the day? And under the aegis of what liquid? Am I a wine person or a coffee person, right? And those questions are really best dealt with by kind of a self-interrogation. You have to do a self-inventory. Because I remember a guy coming to the MFA program that I was at years ago, and he said, you must, here is the process. You must write for 4 hours to enter the spiritual state necessary to create. And he'd written these beautiful stories that I really admired. So for years, I carried that as 4 hours. I've got to get 4 hours and then I'll enter the spiritual sanctum of da-da-da. And that was like a great thing for him. Didn't work for me. I maxed out. I couldn't concentrate that long. And I spent many years sort of hoping that he had the fairy dust, but he didn't. You have the fairy dust and it's an undependable supply. And when you find it, as I feel like I kind of did with Lorena, then you just have to don't question it. For me anyway, I did not want to get into elaborate plotting and I wanted to say it's about Lorena. The decisions that she makes are going to set off these chain reactions. Let me just chase it. And for somebody who's spent so much time pushing characters around, hoping they bump into the big ticket items, it was a great relief to finally just be chasing one.
So Daniel says we have time for one more question. And how about Mr. Seabar? I'm so sorry, Lafayette. We'll have time later though. Yeah,
I'll answer any or all questions in punishing detail. So
Sagittarian question. Was there a kernel of some sort of autobiographical patina that you like Lorena? Was there some way into the?
So the question is, and what is your sign, Paul? Sagittarius, sorry, I missed that. So Paul Seabar in the back, Sagittarius, has asked the question, was there real life inspiration, I think, for Lorena? Somebody from your youth, somebody from your life. What was the inspiration?
Yeah, I don't think for Lorena in particular, but I will tell you that living in El Paso, I think was hugely influential for me. I lived in a place over the Sunset Grocery. It's a famous building because architectural students were always sketching it. They're out in front sketching it. It's a beautiful building. It's right over I-10 and it overlooks the Rio Grande. And for me at age 21 as a very sheltered person, like if I got up early enough in the morning, what I could see was the day maids coming over from Juarez. And these were generally young women. They would hire a mula because the Rio Grande is really dirty and really fast and dangerous at certain times of the year. So they would have to get across the Rio Grande, usually on these guys' shoulders, and they would be carrying their clothing for work because most of them were day maids. They were doing work, in other words, that most Americans would not do, certainly at a pay that Americans wouldn't accept. So they had these. So kind of walking, these guys are walking them across the river, and then they have these bags on their head and they scamper up the concrete embankment. They peel back the chain link fence and they invade America. That's what they're doing, right? And they do that, and then they had to change. It usually is happening like early in the morning. They have to change into their work clothes in the dawn, so they have to undress and then put on their work clothes, and hoping the whole time that the INS vans, the Migra vans, were not going to come in and deport them. And then they would kind of run through the low scrub and get to South El Paso Street and try to blend in with that street light, then take a bus up to whatever homes they were cleaning, whatever. And then they would walk back to Juarez at night. They did not do this because they were inherently like, this is a great way to spend my life. They did it for the same reason that any of us do our jobs, to make money and create more opportunity for the people around them, in particular their children. That was immigration. Now, at age 21, 31, 41, I was not prepared to really write about that experience. But by the time I hit 50 and we were taking traumatized refugee children and taking them away from their parents at the border, causing permanent trauma to all of those families in what to me remains the most fascistic and shameful event which we participated in as Americans. By that time, I was ready to write about and try to understand the way in which our immigration system essentially operates as a criminalization of the American dream. It's essentially what we're saying to people who are from certain countries who look a certain way, because nobody leaves their home unless they have to. Just think about it for half a second. So that feeling of being born lucky as like a white dude is to the 10th power because of the ridiculous coincidence of having been born in this era and in this country, the insane privilege of having an American passport and birthright. That wasn't something I was prepared to write about, even 10 years ago. I did write about El Paso in my first short story collection. I wrote about being a heavy metal critic and about kind of the sexual idiocy of my 30s. That's what I was prepared at that time in my career to write about. Now, as an older person, thinking more deeply and trying to reflect on the American circumstance, this is the set of stories I want to tell. Lorena is certainly a part of it. Something, the book proceeds from an alleged crime that I remember taking place in my hometown, but there is no cognate for Lorena in particular, though there are real clear and obvious autobiographical elements that led me to write about what the book is ultimately sort of steers towards, which is our ideas of immigration.
Great. Well, thank you, Steve, so much I just feel like one of the things you do is you put the struggle to create things like on the outside for us to see. So thank you for sharing that with us, and congratulations on finishing the novel after 30 years. I'm very happy for you, and I hope the book is a wonderful success. I will also just say, since this is a fairly small group, that
It's not that small.
well,
Almost
not that
every
small.
chair
I
is
take that
taken
back.
here.
I
Yeah.
take that back 100%. But
You guys far exceeded my expectations. I have a little over under, and it was like, well, if there are 11 people, I'll be delighted. And there have to be 150 of you out there.
yeah. 200 maybe. Yeah.
200
for
maybe.
sure. It's, people have to really want to come out these days, I think, in these times. But thank you all for coming. And for anybody who would like to, we are going to have a little get together after this, and you should see this man right here. Raise your hand, Ken. If you want to know more about that, I will disappear and go like mix drinks and things like that. And Steve will stay here to sell some books. So please see this gentleman to get yourself a
Yes.
book.
If you're going to buy a book, buy it from Boswell. Buy several from Boswell.
Yes.
You can buy it from whatever independent bookstore you want. So, but you are here. So, but for the folks at home, thank you, Mary Louise. Thank you, Steve, for an amazing event. We'll be sending you out a copy of the recording. If the recording is successful, it looks like it is. So please share with other people and post wherever you'd like. We'll be signing at the front desk. We have Mr. Almond's book for sale, as well as 2 of your backlist titles that were available. They weren't available before the event, but they're available now. And thank you all for coming. We hope to see you at another event.
Yeah, thank you, guys.